Have you ever noticed how so many people look at their credit score almost like it's a grade, telling them whether they're good or bad with money? When the number goes up, they feel relieved. When it drops, it feels like something went wrong. And almost every time, the reaction is the same. The credit bureaus must have changed something. Maybe the bank did something. My score just dropped for no reason. It's interesting how people are always looking for someone to blame, except the place where the real answer usually is. Because the truth is, a credit score rarely changes out of nowhere. Most of the time, there's been a financial behavior quietly unfolding for weeks, or even months, that simply went unnoticed. Then, when the score finally changes, it feels like it happened overnight. But it didn't. The score was simply late to the story. It was the last piece to move, and that completely changes the way you look at this subject. Because if your credit score is the last piece of the puzzle, then it makes a lot more sense to figure out what's happening before it changes. My name is Ben, and today I'm going to show you the silent financial habits that could be damaging your credit score without you even realizing it. More importantly, I will show you a simple, practical change you can start applying in your everyday life to turn that around. One of the biggest misconceptions about your credit score is believing it's built when your credit card bill is due. Most people grow up hearing the exact same advice: pay your bills on time, never miss a payment, don't let balances go overdue. And none of that is wrong. In fact, those are some of the most important rules for using credit responsibly. But there's one part of the story that almost nobody talks about. There are people who never miss a payment. Their bills are always paid before the due date. They've never received a late payment notice. And yet, year after year, their credit score barely improves, or in some cases, even goes down. Meanwhile, someone else with almost the exact same income seems to build a much stronger credit history without doing anything extraordinary. At first glance, that doesn't make much sense. How can two people who both pay everything on time end up with completely different results? A lot of people assume the answer must be hidden somewhere inside the credit system itself. Maybe it's the bank, maybe it's the credit bureau, maybe it's just bad luck. But most of the time, the explanation is much simpler than that. The difference usually starts long before any payment is ever made. It begins with ordinary day-to-day decisions that don't even seem connected to your credit score. The way you swipe your card, the timing of your purchases, how often you rely on credit instead of cash, or how much of your available credit quietly disappears month after month. On their own, none of those decisions feels particularly important. Most people barely even notice them. But together they create patterns, and those patterns tell a story. Not just about your money, but about your financial behavior, whether your spending looks controlled or impulsive, whether you're using credit as a tool, or depending on it just to get through the month. That's why thinking of your credit score as nothing more than a record of on-time payments can be so misleading. Because by the time your payment is due, much of that story has already been written. And that's exactly what makes this topic so fascinating. Because improving your credit score isn't just about what happens on payment day. It's mostly about what happens on every other day leading up to it. And that brings us to an important question. If paying on time isn't the whole story, what exactly is your credit score seeing long before your payment is ever due? That last question is really the key to understanding everything else. Because your credit score doesn't wait until your statement is due to start forming an opinion about you. Long before any payment is ever made, it's already paying attention to something far more valuable: patterns. Think about it this way. Imagine you've just met someone. You probably wouldn't decide whether that person is responsible based on a single decision they made. You'd pay attention to what they do consistently, whether they seem reliable, whether their behavior changes every week, whether their decisions seem intentional or simply reactive. Credit works almost the same way. The system doesn't look at just one purchase. It looks at hundreds of them over time. It's not trying to understand one difficult month. It's trying to figure out whether that month was an exception or part of a much bigger pattern. And that's a completely different way of thinking about a credit score. Because consistency tells a much bigger story than isolated events ever can. Every financial decision leaves behind a small signal. On its own, that signal may not mean much. A purchase, a statement, a month when you spent more than usual. None of those things automatically define who you are. But once those signals start repeating themselves, something interesting happens. They stop looking like isolated decisions, and they start looking like habits. And habits are exactly what a credit score is trying to measure. Not who you are, but how predictable your relationship with credit has become. That's why two people can spend exactly the same amount of money and still send completely different signals. One person's behavior communicates control, the other's communicates dependence, even if both of them pay their credit card bill on time. And that's exactly where a lot of people's expectations start to fall apart. Because it's easy to assume this conversation is going to be about late payments, collections, or maxed out credit cards. Those things certainly matter, but that's not what this video is really about. The habits we're about to look at are much quieter than that. Millions of people repeat these behaviors every single month without giving them a second thought. The problem is that those same habits can make your financial behavior look far riskier than it actually is. And the first one is probably far more common than you think. In fact, this habit is so common that it might even sound a little strange to you. Because it isn't using a credit card. The credit card itself was never the real problem. Millions of people use credit cards every single day without hurting their credit score. The problem begins when the credit card stops being just a payment method and starts becoming the way every spending decision gets made. Let me explain what I mean. There's a huge difference between those two things. One person decides how much they're going to spend and then chooses to use a credit card. The other simply uses the credit card and only finds out how much they spent when the statement arrives. I have to be honest with you, I used to be that person. I only found out how much I'd spent when my credit card statement showed up. And if you've ever been that person too, let me know in the comments. It's always interesting to share experiences. That difference may seem small, but in practice, it completely changes your relationship with credit. Because spending without a plan almost never happens through one single purchase. It shows up in dozens of small decisions that seem completely harmless. The coffee you grab on your way to work, ordering lunch because cooking feels like too much effort that day, a quick Amazon purchase because something went on sale, an Uber ride, a new streaming subscription, a subscription you forgot about that's still renewing every month. None of those purchases seems big enough to worry about, and that's exactly why they go unnoticed. The problem isn't any one of those purchases by itself. It's the way they begin to pile up. Without deciding on a spending limit beforehand, each of those decisions feels small, but they're all competing for the same money. Little by little, credit stops being a planned financial tool and starts functioning like an extension of your income. That's exactly when the patterns begin to emerge. Remember what we talked about in the previous section? Your credit score isn't trying to interpret one single purchase. It's watching the behavior that keeps repeating itself. When someone spends months using their credit card without a clear plan, that behavior usually leads to predictable consequences. Their credit utilization starts creeping up. Balances stay higher for longer. Some months, they stop paying the full statement balance. Other months, the credit card becomes necessary simply because the money in their checking account ran out sooner than expected. Notice that none of these situations happens overnight. They develop gradually. And that's exactly what makes this habit so dangerous. Because people caught in this pattern usually believe they're still in control. After all, almost every purchase seems reasonable in the moment. But once you repeat that same behavior month after month, it makes you appear far more dependent on credit than you probably realize. That's why the real problem was never swiping the card. It was swiping the card before deciding how much you were actually willing to spend. It may seem like a subtle difference, but it's the difference between someone who uses credit as a tool and someone who, without realizing it, begins relying on credit to maintain their lifestyle. And there's another habit that I personally believe is even more common than this one that can make even financially disciplined people appear much riskier than they really are. Before I explain, let me ask you a question. When your credit card company increases your credit limit, what do you actually see? A bigger financial safety net? Or new money that suddenly appeared? It sounds like a simple question, but the answer reveals a habit that quietly affects far more people than they realize. Because one of the easiest mistakes to make is treating your available credit as if it were part of your income. Picture this. You get an email from your bank. Congratulations, your credit limit has been increased. Nothing else about your financial life has changed. Your paycheck is exactly the same. Your savings haven't grown. Your monthly bills are exactly what they were yesterday. The only thing that's changed is the amount you're allowed to borrow. But then something interesting usually happens. That new phone suddenly feels affordable. The bigger TV doesn't seem so unrealistic anymore. Upgrading your next vacation suddenly feels within reach. Monthly payments start replacing total prices. Instead of asking, can I actually afford this? The question quietly becomes, can I fit this into my available credit? It's such a simple shift, and yet it's an incredibly dangerous one. Because lifestyle inflation doesn't always begin with a raise. Sometimes it begins with a higher credit limit, not because people suddenly become irresponsible, but because the human brain naturally adapts to whatever resources appear to be available. If it feels accessible, it starts feeling usable. And that's exactly where your relationship with credit begins to change. Instead of working as a tool for planned purchases or emergencies, your available credit gradually becomes part of your normal spending power. The problem is that your credit score can't see your intentions. It doesn't know whether you plan to pay everything off next month. It only sees the pattern that's developing. Higher balances, more of your available credit being used, a lifestyle that appears increasingly dependent on borrowed money. And here's something worth paying attention to. Over time, higher credit utilization can signal greater financial risk, and that causes your credit behavior to move in a direction that credit scoring models recognize. That's why a credit limit increase should never feel like a raise. It simply represents a greater ability to borrow money. Nothing more. That money was never yours. You were simply given permission to access it if you choose to. And there's something even more surprising that very few people realize. There's another habit that can hurt your credit score, even if you always pay your bill on time and never come close to maxing out your credit card. To make this easier to picture, imagine two people. They earn almost the same income. They both pay their bills on time. They've both been using credit cards for years. Then, on an ordinary Tuesday, life happens. One of them needs a new set of tires after a blowout leaves the car unsafe to drive. A few weeks later, the family dog needs emergency veterinary care, or maybe an unexpected medical bill shows up. Nothing extraordinary, nothing dramatic, just the kind of expenses that sooner or later show up in almost everyone's life. And that's exactly where these two stories begin to go in completely different directions. The first person transfers money from their emergency fund, the bill gets paid, life moves on. The second person reaches for a credit card, not because they want to, but because they don't have another option. The emergency itself was never the real problem. The real problem was that, little by little, the credit card quietly took the place of an emergency fund. At first, that doesn't seem like a big deal. After all, isn't that what credit is for? Sometimes yes, but when that becomes the automatic response every time life gets more expensive, something starts to change. The balance doesn't disappear at the end of the month. It follows you into the next one. Then another unexpected expense shows up before the first one has even been paid off. Credit utilization goes up. The balance sticks around longer, and little by little, borrowing money stops being temporary and starts becoming part of your normal financial routine. That's the invisible shift almost nobody notices. The real problem was never the flat tire, or the medical bill, or the emergency trip to the vet. The real problem was not having cash available to handle ordinary life events without relying on credit. If you've been paying attention throughout this video, you already know the real issue is when that dependence turns into a habit, a pattern. That's the moment your credit score starts recognizing it too. Because from the outside, it has no idea why you're carrying a balance. It only sees that borrowed money has become part of the way your financial life operates. When you step back and look at all three habits together, something becomes very clear. Using your credit card without a spending plan, treating your available credit like income, and living without an emergency fund all look like different mistakes. But they all grow from the same root. Each one increases the chances that credit stops being a tool and slowly becomes something your daily life depends on. The good news is that the opposite is just as true. If repeated habits can quietly build a weaker credit history, they can also build a stronger one. Not through shortcuts, and definitely not by trying to trick the system, but by changing the way you use credit every single day. What I'm about to show you is a simple, practical solution that can make every financial decision you make start working in your favor. And if you apply it consistently, improving your credit score will stop feeling like a matter of luck and start becoming the natural result of better financial habits. After learning about these three habits, it's natural to think the next step is finding a strategy to improve your credit score. But that's still looking in the wrong place, because your credit score isn't where the change begins. It's simply where that change eventually becomes visible. Trying to improve your score directly is like staring at a thermometer and expecting the temperature to change. The number is only reflecting something that's already happening somewhere else. The real work begins long before your score ever moves. It begins with the decisions you make before you even swipe your card. That's why, instead of giving you another credit score hack, I'd rather leave you with one simple rule that quietly eliminates the three habits we've talked about. I call it the 24-hour rule. Whenever you're about to make a non-essential purchase with your credit card, don't buy it right away. Wait 24 hours. Then ask yourself two questions. If I had to pay for this today using the money already sitting in my checking account, would I still buy it? And after making this purchase, would my credit utilization still stay at a comfortable level? Those two questions sound incredibly simple, but they force you to interrupt a behavior that often runs on autopilot. And that small pause changes far more than you might expect. It reduces impulse purchases. It makes it much harder to confuse available credit with available income. And it dramatically lowers the chances of your credit card quietly becoming your emergency fund. There's something important to notice here. This rule doesn't improve your credit score directly. It improves your behavior, and your behavior is exactly what your credit score has been observing all along. You're not trying to convince the system that you're a responsible credit user. You're simply becoming one. And over time, your score naturally starts to reflect that new pattern. Imagine someone who normally makes 5 unplanned purchases on their credit card during a typical week. Nothing outrageous. A couple of Amazon orders, a few food deliveries. Now imagine that same person starts following the 24-hour rule. Those 5 purchases don't disappear, but after waiting a day, something interesting happens. Maybe 2 of them still make sense. The other 3 suddenly don't seem nearly as important. Without intentionally trying to spend less, that person starts carrying smaller balances. Without thinking about credit utilization, they naturally use less of their available credit. Without making an extra effort to pay the statement in full, it simply becomes much easier. Nothing magical happened. They simply interrupted a habit before it turned into another month of relying on borrowed money. And that's exactly why this strategy works regardless of how much someone earns. It doesn't depend on making more money. It depends on making one better decision before the money is spent. Because strong credit scores are rarely built by one big financial decision. They're built by hundreds of ordinary decisions that all point in the same direction. And once you start looking at credit this way, something much bigger begins to reveal itself. You begin to understand why so many people misunderstand how a credit score is actually built. It doesn't change because of a single purchase. It doesn't go up or down because of one bad decision. It changes because ordinary decisions, repeated over and over again, eventually become a pattern. And that's exactly what the system has been watching all along. In many ways, a credit score works much more like a mirror than a judge. It doesn't create your financial habits. It simply reflects the ones you repeat. If your relationship with credit is thoughtful and consistent, that's what the mirror eventually shows. If it's impulsive, unpredictable, or constantly dependent on borrowed money, that begins to show too. The mirror isn't deciding who you are, it's simply reflecting the financial behavior you've repeated enough times to make it recognizable. The encouraging part is that this works both ways. Just as small habits can quietly build a weaker credit profile over time, small intentional habits can also build a stronger one. Not overnight, not in a single billing cycle. Because just as poor credit isn't built in a single month, excellent credit isn't either. It's built gradually through choices that seem insignificant on their own, but become meaningful when they're repeated consistently. And after a while, something even more important begins to happen. You stop making smarter financial decisions because you're trying to improve your credit score. You start making them because that's simply how you manage your money. It becomes part of your identity, not just another financial goal. And ironically, that's often when your credit score starts improving without even being the center of your attention. Think back to the beginning of this video. At first, it may have seemed like building a good credit score was mostly about paying your bills on time. Now you can see that the story begins long before that. It begins with the small decisions you make long before any payment is due. And maybe that's the biggest lesson of all. In the end, your credit score is simply telling a story. The real question is this: when that story is written months or even years from now, will it reflect the habits you have today or the habits you decide to build starting now? You don't have to wait months to start improving your financial life. The first change happens the next time you reach for your credit card. Not because you'll spend less, but because you'll pause long enough to understand why you're spending in the first place. Over the next few days, instead of asking yourself, "Can I afford this?" try asking a different question. What does this purchase say about the financial habits I'm building? Sometimes that single question is enough to completely change the decision that comes next. And over time, those decisions begin to shape something much bigger than your credit score. They shape the way you manage money. If one of the habits we talked about today made you recognize something in your own financial behavior, let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear which one stood out to you the most. And if you want to learn more about building a smarter financial life without unnecessary complexity or get-rich-quick gimmicks, make sure to subscribe to the channel. I post new videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.